Welcome back to part two of our lecture, History Before Civilization. In part one, we considered how history was long thought of as man's past since the advent of writing. That is, history was a record of man's past since the advent of writing about 5,000 years ago. And how the old reliable concept, therefore, of prehistoric served to, well, diminish and trivialize everything that came before the time of writing. Now, if we cast that concept of prehistoric aside, wave goodbye to it, if you will, and pay attention to what the evidence offers. Remember, history chiefly defined as a discipline grounded on evidence. So yeah, we cast aside the concept of prehistoric, and what we begin to see based on the evidence is a much older human past, much older than 5,000 years. According to current scholarly estimates, at least 250,000 years. And not only that, but we find a much more interesting history of that deeper human past than a word like prehistoric would imply. You think of prehistoric, you think of what? Sort of corny caveman movies, from the 60s, or, knuckle dragging, pulling your wife by her hair, kind of caveman satire, really. But as it turns out, this deeper history of humankind is much different than those Hollywood send-ups of the Stone Age. Interesting because what the evidence shows, is that our species evolved from older ancestors into the current body type we now possess. Upright, bipedal, that is walking on two legs, big box-shaped skulls, and a body type, what we call the modern body type. We'll consider further now in part two as we continue our look at history before civilization. So a much older, much more dynamic picture we get of our species, Homo sapiens. Now let's start part two here by saying that for all the claims made on behalf of mankind, that maybe the most basic historical fact of our species' history is the existence of our global spread. And what this map shows us is that from that ground zero here in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that about 100,000 years ago, after living in our African habitat for the better part of 150,000 years, that beginning about 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was on the move, that is, as a migrating species beyond the African continent. And these arrows here show various epochs of migration from Africa to the Near East, what we call the Middle East today, the Arabian, across the Arabian Peninsula, across the south, what we call now Europe, the south boundaries of Europe, although that migration will come a bit later. Eventually, some of the latest of these migrations, as recent as 15,000 years ago, sees Homo sapiens moving across that Bering Land Bridge, what was once a ice bridge connecting North America and Asia into what is now the Western Hemisphere. Not to mention other points, what we would consider the Far East of China and Southeast Asia. And interestingly here into what now we call the continent of Australia, as far back as 45,000 years ago, that the people we consider the Aboriginal peoples of Australia have inhabited that land for the last 45,000 years. So a series of migrations, both distant and more recent, historically speaking, into what proved to be the habitable parts of the globe for Homo sapiens. Yeah, and where did we start? Well, we've already said that it was on the African continent. What historians and scholars now believe is that a climate crisis very nearly extinguished our species. Remember, extinction is a part of the living record of Earth, and it includes, among others, our fellow human cousins, if you will, such as Neanderthal, who we looked at yesterday. No longer is that species living on the earth, and it turns out that it was almost the case that Homo sapiens fell prey to a climate crisis about 195,000 years ago, according to the record, the archaeological record. It was the onset of a glacial era, the opposite of our own times, you might think, of global warming. It was a global freezing that sent Homo sapiens numbers into perhaps the low triple digits. Based on the archaeological evidence found, it seemed that these survivors of a global freeze lived or found a milder climate zone on the coast of South Africa, where a mixed diet of marine life and plants provided the essential nutrition to weather this climate change. The extraordinary thing is that scientists believe, therefore, that due to the loss of the broader population of Homo sapiens, that it is from this core group that all people now living are descended. So not Adam and Eve so much as the grandparents, spread across a few hundred maybe survivors of that global freeze. And from that core, then, a resurgence, a renewal of the Homo sapiens species, and ultimately a global arrival during the late Paleolithic age. Remember, Paleolithic is the long period, it translates roughly as Stone Age, the long period that leads up now to the arrival of Homo sapiens on the global scene. And we were the last of the human species to leave. We had been preceded by the others, including Homo neanderthalis, who had left, those human species had left prior to Homo sapiens' departure. So the Homo sapiens are the last humans to leave Africa. As you can see from this map, color-coded here in blue, are Homo sapiens who by 100,000 years ago are crossing what is now the Red Sea Straits into the Arabian Peninsula. The others who preceded us, including Neanderthals, are going as well across the African continent into that same immediate area of the Arabian Peninsula, but from there spreading clear beyond to the farther reaches of Asia and what we call today Central Asia and Europe. If you follow the red arrows, you can see that ultimately that migration will take Homo sapiens across the hemispheric divide, a kind of an imaginary divide of our globe, into what we now call the Western Hemisphere of the Americas. That being the most recent of these continental migrations, as recently as 15 to 16,000 years ago. Not shown on this map would be the oceanic migrations from Southeast Asia into the connecting island chains of the South Pacific, that happening as recently as 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. So the Middle East, to summarize, the Middle East, Homo sapiens find the Middle East by 100,000 years ago. What we now call China by 67,000 years ago. Australia, 45 to 50,000 years ago. And what we now call Europe by about 50,000 years ago. The most recent, as we've seen, of these global migrations 15,000 years ago entering the Americas, what the ancestors of those who we'll call Native Americans. Now, what do we make of this? Well, this pattern of migration certainly sets apart Homo sapiens as a world traveler, and so we refer to this as the first of our species globalizations. Won't be the last, but the first of our species globalizations meant that by foot, traveling in small hunter-gatherer bands, our species doggedly and consistently followed migratory paths into the broader global environment. And when I say environment, I should say the diverse environments of the globe, involving many climate changes, changes in topography from forest to desert, in other words, changes in elevations from lows to highs, you might say, from desert valleys to mountain stretches. In other words, across the diverse habitable zone of our Earth, Homo sapiens will eventually trek. So the question that should occur to you is why? Why after 150 years, 50,000 years of habitation in Africa, did it seem so necessary for our species to, well, get up and move? Well, maybe how is a better question than why, although we'll deal with both of these, because in some ways, how holds the answer to why. As a species, we lacked both the raw strength of other animal species, not to mention the speed. We were neither as strong as the elephant or as swift as the cheetah, but we did possess other possible advantages that helped ensure our survival. So think about physical adaptations and the imperative for survival as playing into the key reasons now as to why Homo sapiens will become the migratory specialist. Were we born to run? It was several years ago when I got involved in an effort to run a marathon, which I won't keep you in suspense. Happily, I can tell you I, in fact, completed a marathon and became one of those obnoxious people, to put the little sticker in the back of the car window. Yeah, it's true. But what I took away from that whole experience was a newfound appreciation for our anatomy and how we were especially well adapted toward forward movement, including not just walking, but also running. Our legs and our bipedal frame, our legs possessing shorter tendons, particularly our Achilles tendon down here that connect our calf muscles to our heels. These are shorter, kind of stretchier, but not terribly stretchy tendons that serve as a kind of fulcrum point, if you will, for our forward movement. Our long femur bones offered for an impressive stride. In fact, at full run, the human stride is actually longer than the stride of a horse, even though horses are bigger and ultimately faster animals. We nevertheless, per our body weight ratio, had powerful legs with long strides and that gluteus maximus muscle which would help drive those limbs forward in a runner's motion, also made it possible for us not to be the fastest animal, not the swiftest, but nevertheless, in a feat of endurance, helped, by the way, by our ability to keep our eyes front and center, our heads and chins up while we run, and most importantly, to breathe, to continue our respiration while running. Loose but stable muscle joints in our shoulders, that is skeletal and muscular joints in our shoulders, also allowed for that balancing effect and propelling effect of our arms forward and back. But yeah, being able to keep our heads up and being able to take in respirations, to breathe while running, meant that we could effectively cover ground in a kind of endurance athlete fashion, which helped us not only in the hunting of prey, but also just in the forward movement of what becomes our migratory pattern. So much better than certain animals, human beings, it seems, could in fact cover diverse kinds of terrain, well adapted physically for climbing and even rappelling. We were able to encounter different kinds of topography, different kinds of terrain that made it possible for us now to move over long distances. From our stretchy tendons to our stabilizer muscles, particularly in our core, to our ability to breathe, and our ultimate stride distance, all of which helped Homo sapiens now in a migratory career. Other adaptations, of course, arose as well, some of them from our inherent limitations. I said in the part one lecture that we tend to be rather narcissistic, we humans, and in giving ourselves credit and arrogating to ourselves most of the, credit for, the important developments in the global past. But truth be told, it was often our limitations that forced us to adapt rather than our inherent advantages. Now, it's true, among our chief advantages was our capacity for learning and teaching. Those big box brains that I mentioned, we'll have more to say about as we go along, but in particular, our ability to learn on the fly, to preserve memory of our learning, and to pass that learning on critically to our offspring. So inherited learning, you might say. Part of that respiratory system was our ability to stay cool while traveling. I know the picture here shows a snowy climb, but think back to the more temperate zones and hotter climates. Our ability to sweat. There's a $1 million industry to keep us from sweating today, the antiperspirant industry. But without the ability to sweat, we would have never made it across those temperate zones to regulate our body temperature, in other words, and to stay cool while traveling. Our ability to fashion tools, which was in no small part due to our impressive digital dexterity, that is our hands and fingers, our ability, our prehensile thumb. Think of how you use your thumb in the day-to-day world of manipulating objects, whether it be a pencil in your hand or a knife for cutting. The thumb was a quite handy tool in its own right. Our ability to therefore prepare foods, whether it was through hunting or gathering, and even to control fire in the preparation of those foods, and for other reasons, fuel and energy, heat source energy. A long-term period of lactation, some anthropologists believe, also made humans better suited to travel. That is, mothers who delivered infants could continue to breastfeed those infants for well, years, really, thereby eliminating the need to gain extra food from the environment. If the mother could be fed, then the child could be fed as well. But consider some of our limitations. Compared to other animals, we have weak jaws, blunt teeth, and only one stomach. Notice the cow off stage left is snickering. Only a single stomach from which we can chew and digest a rather limited store of food products. Think of a dog. Well, a dog can eat seemingly almost anything, but not humans. We at least can't benefit from eating almost anything. We have a rather limited dietary scope. But that meant that we had to be shrewder hunters and gatherers. That in itself will compel our migration as we search for sustenance and increase slowly the numbers in our hunter-gatherer bands, which, by the way, so we have a later comparative point for civilization. It's thought that the typical hunter-gatherer band might have only ranged from, say, a couple dozen to maybe 3 dozen people. And these bands might come together periodically throughout the season to form slightly larger, say, tribal groups. But insofar as the carrying capacity, you really needed to keep your numbers small because of the imperative to be able to feed people at any given time and to satisfy the material requirements of shelter and clothing. So it made sense to keep numbers low, sort of, groups of immediate nuclear families, you might say, who could combine with other groups at times throughout the season, maybe for purposes of hunting or otherwise sharing of resources, ceremonial purposes, but otherwise, keeping the neighborhood pretty lean in terms of numbers. So all of these adaptations due to our physical and cerebral abilities, some of them actually limitations when compared to other animals, allowed us not only to fend for ourselves, but ultimately to deal with a wide range of climates and ecological changes. And where was warfare? Well, there's disagreement about this, but let's say that warfare as we understand it is a relatively recent innovation. That is, large armies amassed across, broad plains doing battle. That's all in the last 5,000 years. Because of the size of these hunter-gatherer bands, nothing like large-scale warfare would have really been possible. That doesn't mean there wasn't internecine conflict, that is, within the bands, individuals for various reasons at cross purposes, or even between bands, that is, over hunting grounds and that sort of thing. But warfare on a modern scale, no, we have to wait for civilization. Our species seemingly has always possessed a kind of aggressive instinct, you might say, as part of an animal kingdom where obviously, competition for food and protection from other predators necessitated the ability to fight. But we'll save warfare for the more recent, say, last 5,000 years of human history. I didn't mention speech, but by comparison, scholars think we've only had that adaptation for maybe the last 35,000 years. So other ways of communication, for sure, what we might consider nonverbal communication, but the ability to just talk to one another in language, that's a more recent adaptation. The development of a voice box and vocal cords capable of enunciating spoken language. So we might say that Homo sapiens over our career, first a long career in Africa, responding most likely to continued climate change at least 100,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, but the settled consensus seems to about 100,000 years ago, in response to environmental and perhaps climate imperatives began to move from Africa using these adaptations, these adaptive behaviors that made us well suited now to range over different topographies and different climates. Our first globalization, as we say, as a species. And despite that widespread migration, Homo sapiens has, over that last 100,000 year period, remained very closely related genetically. According to DNA research, all humans living today are descended from a figurative African Eve, although, as we said before, really a set of grandparents, you might say, who hunkered down during the global cooling 190,000 years ago or so. But in this case, a figurative African Eve, a mother who lived in sub-Saharan Africa during the Paleolithic era over 200,000 years ago. All humans today are members of a single species called Homo sapiens, which translates, as I said before, literally from the Latin as wise humans. A bit more of that narcissism that we talked about. But as the little caption here to the study said, we are all extremely related to one another. And genetics has borne this out, that is the science of genetics. And what does it tell us? It confirms the picture of human migration and genetic connection. So even though we spread out from one another, we remain genetically connected. The idea of a pure ethnicity or race is simply a fiction. In fact, the concept of race itself is not even part of that scientific classification of kingdom, phylum, all the way down to family, genus, and species. No race in that list. Race is a cultural construct, you might say, a post-invention of our global migration, related mostly to skin color. And I have posted for you in this first unit, this first module, a video, a fascinating video, only about 18 minutes, well worth your time to look at, I would think, that explains the adaptation known as skin color. What biologists call a phenotype, that is a kind of superficial, only skin deep, you might say, adaptation due to environmental needs across the globe, from the bright, light, hot desert regions of the equatorial or temperate regions of the equatorial zone to the colder, darker regions of the north. We were encoded with the genetic adaptability of skin color. But that adaptation, that phenotype, doesn't begin to touch the underlying genetic base that makes us all human. In fact, it's one of the things that makes us human, even though we tend to see it as a distinction between different colored peoples of the world. It is really a common capacity for adaptation that gives us color. So genetic differences among humans are minor, such as skin color. A phenotype, as biologists call it, which is a kind of adaptive ability for dealing with particular environments. Far more impressive is our relatedness, genetically speaking, to one another. So we remain grouped as Homo sapiens, even though cultural conceits and habits of discrimination or prejudice may label this group or that group a different race. But again, that's something that we, in our big box imaginations, simply conjured up, a kind of fiction, if you will, that labels the phenotype of color as a race. Think of race as a cultural invention and you'll be fine. Now, to say that something was invented doesn't mean that it hasn't exerted great influence over our behavior, right? I mean, we can believe in all kinds of things, all kinds of imaginations that, look, when I was a little kid, Santa Claus was a big motivator for me, But just because we imagine something to be true. And because, therefore, we are influenced by that belief, it doesn't mean that it is factually correct or even historically accurate. And so we come back to that word prehistoric and we think, well, okay, Paget, you're talking about our human past before the advent of civilization. Okay, we'll grant you that we were around, but we weren't civilized, and therefore it's not particularly important, right? Right? Wrong. As it turns out, what old-fashioned terms like prehistory would acknowledge, a long and remarkable history of successful existence. I mean, think about this for a second. For 240,000 years prior to the agricultural revolution or the rise of civilization, for 240,000 years, the Paleolithic period represents over 95% of our time on Earth. That is, for 95% of our histories as a species on Earth, we spent in the age before either civilization or agriculture. And so we shouldn't be so quick to diminish a formula that kept us going for 240,000 years. Look, I don't know about you, but some days I wake up and I wonder if we're going to make it another year. We've only lived in the industrial age for 250 years, right? Multiply that by a factor of 1,000, you have some idea of the success now of our ancestral Homo sapiens species succeeding over global habitations for the last 100,000 years, but a total tenure of more like 240,000 years, during which time we lived a social existence, as I've mentioned, in relatively small and relatively egalitarian bands, by the way, that were resourceful, innovative, and mobile in a wide variety of environments. I say egalitarian not because everyone was completely equal. Thomas Jefferson, an American slave owner, is famous for having written the phrase, all men are created equal, but we've never seen equality in any appreciable degree during the history of civilization. In fact, one of the first adaptations that our species made in civilization was to render people in hierarchy, social hierarchy from high to low. In other words, inequality. But prior to that time, the long stretch of the Paleolithic period, there was no reason to have great hierarchies. I mean, the most practical reason for having anything is that it helped our survival, right? In a competitive and fluid environment. And so it meant that people, generally speaking, had to be able to do lots of things. You don't see the raw specialization, that you will, in civilization. That is, the assigning of certain tasks to individuals to specialize in, to do over and over. Everyone had to pretty much be able to do almost everything. And even if there was a rough breakdown, say if men hunted or women foraged, then you can bet that men and women also did both. That men also helped forage and women also helped in hunting. There just wasn't, I guess we would say, the luxury or the need of specialization. And so we say egalitarian bands. Sure, there would have been some members of a band with perhaps greater status due to age or physical prowess or some other ritual significance. But generally speaking, it was a world in which pretty much everyone shared in the daily imperative of survival. And in very accomplished ways. I mean, again, for 240,000 years, if we've been in civilization for 5,000, then I guess I would ask you, do you think we got another 235,000 years in us? Like I say, there are days I wake up when I wonder if we have another year in us. But in any event, testing has shown how these and other stone tools found along a shoreline on the island of Crete in the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, to be at least 130,000 years old. I mentioned this in part one of the earlier lecture, that is, these stone tools, processed stone tools, suggest human habitation of that island as far back as 130,000 years ago. We don't count that in the overall migration from Africa starting 100,000 years ago, because it doesn't seem to have sparked a global following, you might say. It was the case that Crete was considered more to be part of Africa at that time. But nevertheless, a separate island part, and one that would have required a seagoing voyage to get there. So manipulating of environment, whether it's by traveling on ocean water or Mediterranean sea water in this case, or the fashioning of stone tools, that remarkable series of adaptation allowed Homo sapiens basically to reinvent themselves over and over again, ultimately into who we are today. And who are we today? Technologically dependent, schedule-based, anatomically modern humans. And even though we won't try to answer the question now, the natural inclination, I think, is to see this history of adaptation in the frame of progress. In other words, you're getting better all the time, humans. Well, ultimately, that's a kind of value judgment. I mean, the only ultimate baseline judgment is that of survivability. And if that's the case, our hunter-gatherer ancestors survived for, as I say, 240,000 years. We haven't come close to matching that tenure, so we can't, I think, easily or cavalierly claim that it's all been in the name of progress. I mean, you may not want to give up your smartphone or your drive-through late at night, or your favorite mode of conveyance, your electric bicycle, or automobile, or what have you. But that doesn't necessarily equate to improvement in the ultimate sense of survivability. In fact, we might say that those adaptations have made us more dependent and therefore more vulnerable, to some species-wide disaster. So what I'm trying to say here is that we have to get rid of this idea that with every adaptation, we've taken a step forward on the progress chart. We've certainly taken steps forward on the adaptation chart, but whether those adaptations easily translate to progress, well, that's a harder question. During the Middle Paleolithic age, humans had developed techniques for pressure flaking. That is, the working of tools with fire to better control the shape, sharpness, and thickness of those tools. This led to an evolving food culture with greater consumption of meat, both land and sea animals, to supplement the mostly otherwise vegetarian diet, adding, it's thought, to the brain and body development of our species. Evidence suggests that 160,000 years, humans living in a coastal South Africa developed even a calendar, a lunar calendar, to plan when to harvest certain seafood. You might call it the predecessor to farming, or maybe aqua farming, in that they calculated through seasons of the year based on the appearance of lunar moon phases when the time was most opportune for harvesting certain kinds of edible sea life. During the tidal periods, for example, of ebb tides, when that sea life would be more vulnerable to hunting by humans. In other words, all these adaptations over time will kind of mix together to create a more schedule-based, tool and technology-dependent, anatomically modern humans. Now, I read that earlier, suggesting that's who we are today. But if you're following my reasoning here, it's true, that's who we were 100,000 years ago. Long before the first civilizations, Homo sapiens made a cultural imprint on the historical record. Sure, it wasn't writing as we would consider it in the time of civilization, but it was its own kind of expression. 100,000 years ago, a craftsman or craftswoman sat in a cave overlooking the Indian Ocean in South Africa, crushed a soft, rusty red rock, mixed it inside a shell with charcoal and animal marrow, and dabbed it on something, maybe a face or perhaps a wall. In other words, think of it as an early artist's kit. And it required, as archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood says, that our ancestors understood basic chemistry in the creation of that artistic kit. But why did they want it? Why did they want this red sort of clay paint to begin with? Was it for body decoration, cave decoration, or both? And if so, what did that art signify? Well, listen, I don't know about you, but I love human art, and I spend whatever time I spend on, say, social media, usually Instagram, looking at human art today. It was our compulsion to express ourselves 100,000 to 150,000 years ago that had us seeking this rudimentary understanding of chemistry to create materials through which we could express ourselves and leave traces behind for future generations to marvel. For 100,000 years before civilization, in other words, humans demonstrated a self-awareness and conscious connection to the larger forces of nature and created the first, art museums, if you will. Carved into rock or spread over rock, whether it be the art rock of South Africa or the Venus figurine carved into a rock found in modern-day France. Both of these predate human civilization by thousands of years. And in the case of the Venus figurine and some of these figures here, this idea of a figurative art, of representing a kind of selfie, if you will, a sort of self-portrait that often combined anatomically human features with other more wildly imaginative features. As we'll see, a kind of mashup of human and other animal features that scholars and art historians think probably expressed a more cosmic understanding, a more cosmic imagination. Certainly, it was our developing capacity to imagine things that, strictly speaking, do not exist in nature that will give Homo sapiens a kind of noted difference, if you will, in their history as a species from perhaps other animal species. According to a San rainmaking prayer, and the San are the indigenous peoples of South Africa, let the clouds rain so that we can live joyfully. Let the fields food grow so that we can find onions, a staple in the San diet, a basic necessity that I would suggest connects those Paleolithic ancestors with us today. As we saw in the early pandemic of 2020, one of the first things that people tend to want to acquire, if not actually hoard, were the commodities from your local grocery store. And so for this rainmaking prayer to express a need for onions is no more strange or exotic than our own clamoring for toilet paper and paper towel in the early stages of the pandemic. What might that sound like to some future generation of Homo sapiens should our species continue to survive on Earth? Well, I think we can find here a kind of kindred spirit in what seems an almost modern identity thousands of years before civilization. So yeah, evidence to tell the story of the past from our living world of the 21st century to the living world of 200,000 years ago. It was those Paleolithic ancestors, the San people with their distinctive click speak or language, still thought to be the oldest still spoken language in the world today. Their numbers have diminished, but they're still there. A living bit of historical evidence, you might say, of our deeper, more fascinating human past. The San of Southern Africa are one of two groups of indigenous African people with the least DNA mutations from early anatomically similar humans. They are the living evidence of our species over 200,000 years of history. And why fewer DNA mutations? Because they never left. So much of what our species evolves into, including that phenotype of color, was simply due to our interaction with different global environments. But that base foundation, that base DNA, has been there all along in the San people of South Africa, a kind of vestige, you might say, from our earliest origins as a human people. So to finish up here with part 2, clearly something happens about 40,000 years ago as we begin to see that more expressive, call it artistic or communicative urge of our ancestors. It's what the historian Yuval Noah Harari in his book Sapiens terms the cognitive revolution, borrowing from anthropologists, the cognitive revolution of about 40,000 years ago. And here in this table we can see what it meant, the ability to transmit larger quantities of information being one of the sole outcomes of this cognitive revolution. Something happens in our brains, be it a kind of protein, perhaps evolution of new brain proteins that allowed us to think increasingly in terms of larger quantities of information that then allowed for the planning and carrying out of complex actions. The ability to transmit larger quantities of information about social relationships in particular, forming larger and more cohesive groups, going from that base hunter-gathering population of say 25 to 30, now numbering up to 100 to 150 individuals. This meant we needed to be better planners, better harvesters, better preparers of things like food stores that would allow for a heavier and bigger carrying population now. The ability to transmit larger quantities of information about things that do not really exist, but which we can imagine, whether it be tribal spirits, national groupings, limited liability companies in our own time, corporations, or even the vaunted concept of human rights. What Harari is saying here is that most of those touchstones in our modern time, be it nation states, religious beliefs, modern corporations, or claims of human rights, that all of these sprang from that cognitive revolution 40,000 years ago, and our ability to imagine a different world, to imagine different types of society, to imagine different claims on the transcendent, to imagine the transcendent, a realm of divine spirits or heavenly realms, and to cooperate in much larger numbers, even among those who might be personal strangers to us, is something we do on a daily basis. You might think you know that person checking your groceries at the grocery store, but really you only interact with them in a kind of familiar way. But they remain, their lives essentially remain strangers to you, and yet that ability to imagine connection allows us to function, allows us to relate to one another, and to even innovate those ways of relating and functioning in ever larger populations. So what this second part of the lecture has done today is tried to put into place the various building blocks, if you will, of human adaptation, both as a globally migrating species, but also over time as a increasingly cognitive species. That is, cognitive in the sense of thinking and being able to use our evolving brains to imagine a kind of template of human society that could be imposed on those different environments that would allow for greater numbers, greater sophistication, and greater manipulation of not only the environment but of each other in socially organized forms. In other words, it gives us the foundation to understand what is going to happen next in human history, and what is happening next, as we'll see in the next lecture, is the development of what's called the agricultural revolution. We're still in the old prehistoric phase, but I hope you have at least perhaps a better appreciation, if you didn't already, for the dynamism, the kind of growing sophistication of those who in the past we would dismiss as prehistoric, and the lessons we can learn from them in terms of survivability, sustainability, and long tenure here on Earth. It's that message that we'll carry forward now into the lecture to come.